The county clerk satisfies herself that the document is authentic, and I watch her stamp it twice, once for the court and once for the record. And the sound of that stamp is the only thing moving in the room. Terrence is sitting 12 feet from me with 3 lawyers who bill more per hour than I used to make in a day, and not one of them is breathing. My name is Raymond Okonkwo. I am 67 years old. I spent 41 years fixing heating and cooling systems in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and I spent the last 16 raising 2 children who were not mine to raise, but became mine the night their father left them shivering at a BP station on North Dixie Highway, with a note written on the back of a lottery ticket receipt. That receipt is in a frame now. I keep it in my office at the shop. But I am getting ahead of myself, and the judge has not yet pressed play on the recording, and you do not yet understand what a handheld recorder the size of a deck of cards can do to a man who thought time would erase what he said into it. Let me go back. They see an old man. That is the first thing you need to understand. When Terrence's legal team looked at me across that table during the deposition, they saw a retired HVAC tech with calloused hands and a sport coat he probably bought at the Goodwill on Ring Road. They saw someone who would stumble over legal language, who might cry on the stand, who might be portrayed as a confused grandfather clinging to children out of loneliness. The lead attorney, a man named Marsden from a Louisville firm, actually asked me during the deposition if I understood what a revocable trust was. I told him I understood it well enough to have one. He moved on quickly after that. What they did not see, because people like them never do, is that the man sitting across from them owned the building his small engine repair shop operates from, owned the duplex next door that generates $1,400 a month in rent, owned the 3-bedroom house on Helm Street outright since 2004, and had been offered $1.2 million for his property by a commercial developer 6 months before Terrence suddenly remembered he had children. They did not see that I had met with my attorney, Gerald Fitch, twice a year every year since 2012, updating trust documents, refining beneficiary language, ensuring that every brick of what I built was mortared into a legal structure that could not be shaken by a man who could not be bothered to answer his phone the night his babies needed him. They saw an old man. That is fine. I have been underestimated by better people than Terrence's lawyers. I came up in this trade the way most of us did, crawling through attics in July, lying on my back under houses in January, inhaling fiberglass insulation until my lungs burned, and writing everything down. Every service call, every complaint, every part number and serial code and warranty date. My wife, Adaizi, used to tease me about the recorder. She called it my black box, like the ones they pull from crashed planes. She said if anything ever happened to me, they could reconstruct my entire life from the tapes in the glove compartment. She was not wrong. She just did not know how right she was. Adaiz died in 2016. Ovarian cancer. The children were 10 and 8. I had already been raising them for 6 years by then, and she had been beside me for every one of those years, teaching Amara to braid hair, teaching Chidi that a man can cry and still be strong, cooking jollof rice on Sundays because Amara would not eat anything else for the first 2 years. When Adaiz went, I taught myself her recipes from her mother's notebook, the one written half in Igbo and half in English, the one with palm oil stains on every page. I burned the rice 4 times before I got it right. Amara ate it and said it tasted like Grandma's. I went to the garage and sat in the truck and did not come back inside for 20 minutes. There are things you do not let children see. That is not weakness. That is architecture. Those first years. I need you to understand what Terrence left behind, because what he came back for only makes sense if you know what he walked away from. Amara was 5. She did not speak for the first 11 days. Not a word. She hid under the workbench at the shop, the big steel one where I rebuilt carburetors, and she would not come out for anyone but me. When she finally talked, the first thing she said was, "Is this where I live now?" Not a question, a negotiation. She was checking whether this was permanent, because nothing in her life had ever been permanent before. I told her, yes, this is where you live now. She went back under the workbench, and I heard her whisper, "Okay." I replaced the batteries in my recorder that night, and I do not know exactly why, except that I knew, somewhere in the part of my brain that has always known how to document things, that I might need a record of what was happening in my house. Chidi was 3. He did not speak much either, but he counted. He counted exits in every room, doors, windows, gaps. His trauma counselor told me later it was a survival behavior that children who have been left learn to map escape routes the way animals do. By year 2, he had stopped counting exits at home, but still did it at school and at the grocery store. By year 4, the counselor said the word breakthrough, and I drove to the parking lot of Walmart and wept in my truck until my chest hurt, because breakthroughs should not be necessary for children who are 4 years old and 7 years old. And it was not their fault, and it was not my fault, and the only person whose fault it was had vanished into whatever life he decided was more important than theirs. Year 6, Terrence's mugshot appeared in the Courier Journal. Fraud charges out of Nashville. I cut the article out with a utility knife at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, and I filed it in the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk, the one labeled with just the letter T. I did not tell Amara or Chidi. They had stopped asking about their father by then. Children stop asking when the silence becomes its own answer. Year 8, the county announced the proposed rezoning of the commercial corridor that included my property. A developer named Whitfield from Lexington offered me $1.2 million. I declined, not because I did not need the money, but because that shop is where my hands learned their trade and where Amara learned hers, and where Chidi swept floors after school, and because some things are not for sale to men who see land as numbers on a spreadsheet. I called Gerald Fitch that week and updated the trust. Everything routed through the Okonkwo family trust, irrevocable for the minors, structured so that no outside party, and I was specific about this, no biological parent who had relinquished practical custody could petition for access to the trust assets. Gerald raised an eyebrow at that. I told him I was just being careful. He said I was being strategic. I told him it was the same thing when you have been doing it long enough. Year 10. A private investigator called the house. Said his name was Garland. Said he had been retained to locate my grandchildren for a client he could not name. I hung up, changed the locks that evening, and installed 4 cameras before midnight. I am an HVAC technician. I know how to run wire. I know how to mount hardware in places people do not think to look. I sat at the kitchen table that night with the monitor showing 4 angles of my property, and I thought, he is not coming back for them. He is coming back for the land. And if you are listening to this, and you have ever felt that cold understanding settle into your bones, the realization that someone you raised sees your life's work as an asset to be captured, then you already know what I felt. You do not need me to describe it, but I will tell you what I did with it. I called Gerald Fitch the next morning and said, I need this trust to be a fortress. He said, Raymond, it already is. I said, then make it a fortress with a moat. Year 13. Amara graduated valedictorian from Elizabethtown High School. She stood at that podium in her green cap and she said, I want to thank my grandfather, who taught me that showing up is the hardest and most important thing a person can do. I was in the 3rd row. I had the recorder in my jacket pocket. I do not know why I brought it. Force of habit, maybe. Or maybe I knew that some words need to be preserved because the world will try to rewrite them later. I pressed record, and I caught every word, and I have listened to that recording 9 times since, and it has never once failed to make my throat close. Year 16. Terence arrived. 3 attorneys. A 40-page petition. Claims that I had manipulated the children during their formative years, alienated them from their biological father, and structured the property trust to exclude him from assets he was entitled to as next of kin. 40 pages. I read every one of them at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I finished. The petition referenced the rezoning. It referenced the developer's offer. It referenced the estimated current value of the combined properties. Terence had done his homework, or rather, his lawyers had done it for him, and somewhere in those 40 pages was the ghost of a man who had not called on a single birthday, not sent a single dollar, not written a single letter, but who had somehow found time to research the tax assessor's records for Hardin County. I called Gerald. I said, "He is here." Gerald said, "I know." I said, "I need the recorder." Gerald said, "Which one?" I said, "The one from 2010. The one from the night. Let me tell you about that night, because the courtroom is going to hear it, and you should hear it first. November 14th, 2010. Mr. Pham, who owns the BP station on North Dixie, called the police at 9:47 p.m. to report 2 unattended children in his parking lot. The police called me because Terence had listed me as emergency contact on a form somewhere, probably the only responsible thing he ever did. And even that was accidental. I drove to that gas station in 11 minutes. Amara was sitting on the concrete curb holding Chidi against her chest. She was 5. He was 3. The temperature was 38 degrees. Mr. Pham had given them hot chocolate from the machine inside and wrapped them in a moving blanket he kept in his truck. That man who came to this country with nothing and recognized 2 abandoned children because he understood what it looked like when the people who were supposed to protect you simply walked away. I took the children home. I put them in the living room with blankets and the television on low. And then I called Terence. 17 times. The recorder was running because I had been on a service call earlier that day and had not turned it off, and it caught everything. 17 calls. 17 times the phone rang and went to voicemail. And then at 12:41 a.m., Terence called back. I can hear it now, the specific quality of his voice, loose and unconcerned. And I can hear myself, tight and furious, saying, "Where are you? Where are you? Your children are in my living room, and they are freezing and terrified," and I can hear Terence laughing. Not a cruel laugh. Worse, a dismissive one. The laugh of a man who has already decided this is not his problem. And then the words. They are Raymond's problem now. That is what he said. Not "I will come get them." Not "I am sorry." They are Raymond's problem now. And he hung up. That recording sat in my glove compartment for 16 years. I replaced the batteries twice a year, not because I thought I would need it, but because I take care of my tools. Every tool deserves maintenance. Every record deserves preservation. That is how I was trained, and that is how I live. And it turns out that is how you win in a courtroom against 3 attorneys from Louisville who think they are dealing with a confused old man. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in March at Hardin County Courthouse. Terence's lead attorney, Marsden, opened with a 20-minute presentation about parental rights, about the biological bond, about how the passage of time does not extinguish a father's claim. He was polished. He had slides. He referenced case law. He spoke about my grandchildren as though they were property to be returned to their rightful owner. And I sat there with my hands folded on the table, and I let him finish, because I have learned that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of noise is remain silent until it is time to speak. Gerald stood up. He did not have slides. He had a manila folder, a laptop, and a flash drive. He told the judge that we would like to enter audio evidence into the record. Marsden objected. The judge overruled. Gerald connected the laptop to the court's speaker system. And then, in that wood-paneled room with its fluorescent lights and its water-stained ceiling tiles, the voice of my son filled every corner. 17 outgoing calls, unanswered. Then the callback. Then the laugh. Then the words. They are Raymond's problem now. I watched Terrence's face. I have seen a lot of things in 67 years, but I have never seen a man try to disappear into his own suit jacket. His lead attorney reached for his laptop and closed it. Slowly. The way a man closes a book, he knows he has lost. The judge denied the request for recess. The recording played to its end. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent, when everyone in them has just heard something that cannot be argued with. And then Gerald called his second witness. I did not know this was coming. Gerald had contacted Mr. Pham independently during preparation, and Mr. Pham, this man who had kept that security footage for 16 years in a fireproof safe in his home because he recognized what abandonment looked like, walked into that courtroom in a pressed shirt and sat in the witness chair and authenticated the footage of Terrence walking away from 2 children and driving off in a car that was not even his. Mr. Pham's hands were steady. His English was careful and precise. When Marsden tried to challenge the chain of custody, Mr. Pham produced a notarized log of every time the footage had been accessed, dated, and signed, going back to 2010. The man kept better records than most corporations. Gerald looked at me across the table, and I saw in his eyes something I had only ever seen from other tradesmen when they watched good work being done. Professional respect. Then my grandson asked to speak. Chidi, 20 years old, finishing his EMT certification in Bowling Green, stood up and asked the judge if he could read something into the record. Marsden objected. The judge looked at Chidi, looked at Marsden, and said, "I will allow it." Chidi opened a composition notebook, the black and white kind, and read from entries he had written when he was 7, 8, 9 years old. Grandpa made pancakes. Grandpa took me to the shop. Grandpa said I could hand him the wrenches if I was careful. Today, I did not count the doors. A boy's handwriting becoming a man's voice in a courtroom, and every entry a brick in a wall that Terrence had built around his own absence by simply not being there. The petition for custody restoration was dissolved before lunch. The property challenge was dismissed. The trust was affirmed in its entirety. The judge referred Terrence's filing to Family Services for review of what she called materially false representations in the petition. Marsden packed his briefcase without making eye contact with anyone. Terrence stood in the hallway afterward, and I walked past him, and I realized something that surprised me. I was not angry. I had stopped being angry at Terrence years ago, maybe around year 8 or 9, and what had replaced the anger was not forgiveness exactly, but something more structural. It was the understanding that my life had been built on showing up, day after day, service call after service call, dinner after dinner, permission slip after permission slip, and his life had been built on leaving. And the architecture of those two choices had finally been measured against each other in a room with a judge and a recording and the truth. If you are still listening, and I think you are, because this is not just my story, it is yours too. The one where the person who did the work gets told they do not matter by the person who did nothing. If you have ever been the one who showed up every day without recognition, without thanks, without anyone noticing until you stopped, then you know what that courtroom felt like. not victory. Clarity. Amara runs the shop now, the small engine repair business that Terrence's attorneys described in their petition as a modest trade operation valued at, and I remember the number, approximately $45,000. They did not know about the commercial contracts. They did not know about the fleet maintenance agreement with the county. They did not know that my granddaughter, the girl who once hid under workbenches, had negotiated her first commercial service contract at 22, and that the shop's annual revenue had tripled in the last 3 years. They saw a small engine repair shop in a small Kentucky town, and they assumed small meant insignificant. People who think like that have never rebuilt a Briggs & Stratton engine with their hands. Chidi finishes his EMT certification next month. He wants to work in Hardin County. He says he wants to be the person who shows up when someone calls. I did not teach him to say that. He learned it the way children learn everything, by watching. Sunday dinners at the house on Helm Street. 4 chairs at the table now, always full. Amara, Chidi, Mr. Pham, and me. Mr. Pham brings spring rolls. I make jollof rice from Adiz's mother's notebook. The palm oil stains on those pages are as familiar to me now as circuit diagrams. We eat and we talk, and sometimes we do not talk, and that is fine too, because silence between people who trust each other is not empty. It is full. The recorder sits in the glove compartment of the work truck. I still replace the batteries twice a year. Chidi asked me once why I keep it maintained when I do not do service calls anymore. I told him that tools deserve care whether you are using them or not. That is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that the recorder taught me something about time. Time does not erase. It records. Every moment you show up is a moment preserved. Every moment you do not is a moment preserved too. And eventually, someone presses play. There are studies on this now, on what happens when grandparents raise grandchildren. And the numbers are staggering. Nearly 3 million children in the United States are being raised primarily by grandparents, according to the Census Bureau. And research from the AARP Public Policy Institute found that grandparent caregivers spend an average of over $7,000 per year in out-of-pocket costs raising these children, often on fixed incomes, often without legal custody, often without a single support system acknowledging what they do. $7,000 a year. And that does not count the cost of sleepless nights and school conferences and trauma counselors, and learning to cook your dead wife's recipes from a stained notebook because a 5-year-old will not eat anything else. If you recognize those numbers, if you are living inside them right now, then you already know that the hardest part is not the money. The hardest part is knowing that the people who should have been there chose not to be, and you chose differently. And no one gave you a manual for that choice. I changed the oil in the work truck with Chidi last Saturday. Taught him the way my father taught me, the way I taught Terrence before Terrence decided that grease under your fingernails was something to be ashamed of. Chidi lay on the creeper and slid under the truck, and I handed him the wrench, and he said, 14 millimeter. Right. And I said, that is right. His hands are starting to learn what mine know. Not just the mechanics, the patience, the understanding that maintenance is not a single act, but a practice, repeated until it becomes invisible, which is another word for reliable, which is another word for love. The lottery ticket receipt is still in its frame in the office at the shop. Amara dusts it every week. I asked her once if she wanted me to put it away, and she said no. It reminds me where I started and where I am. She has her grandmother's exactness, and sometimes when she is bent over an engine with a torque wrench, adjusting something by fractions, I see a daze in the precision of her hands, and I have to look away for a moment, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming evidence that showing up works. That it is, in fact, the only thing that does. Terrence lives in Louisville now. I know this because Chidi looked him up once and told me, not asking permission, just informing. I did not ask for details. The architecture of my life does not include a room for Terrence anymore. Not because I built a wall against him, but because he never showed up to occupy the space. If he ever does, genuinely, not with attorneys and petitions and property assessments, but with the willingness to sit at a table and say, I am sorry, and mean it. Then there is a chair. There has always been a chair. But the chair does not wait forever, and the dinner does not get cold while we pretend someone is coming who has given us no reason to believe they will. I am 67. My knees ache when the weather changes. My hands have scars from 4 decades of sheet metal and refrigerant lines, and the specific kind of cuts you get when you are working in a crawl space at 2 in the morning, because someone's heat went out in January. Those hands also held 2 shivering children on a November night and carried them into a house that became their home, and signed custody papers and trust documents and school enrollment forms and 100,000 other pieces of paper that, taken together, constitute the evidence of a life spent showing up. The recorder is in the glove compartment. The batteries are fresh. And if you are out there right now, raising someone else's children because the ones who should have stepped up stepped away, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not a placeholder. You are not a backup plan. You are the plan. You are the whole thing. And one day, maybe in a courtroom, maybe at a graduation, maybe at a kitchen table on a Sunday evening with 4 chairs full and spring rolls and jollof rice and the sound of people you love not needing to say anything at all, the record will show what you did. And it will be enough. It will be more than enough. So tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you raised children who were not yours because the ones who should have did not, I want you to comment their names, not for me, for the record. Because showing up deserves to be documented, and the people who do it deserve to be known. Subscribe if this found you at the right time. Share it with someone who needs to hear that patience is not weakness, that silence is not surrender, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything together.